You ready? You're listening to the Real Pineapple Podcast Network. Good evening, ladies, gentlemen, theys, and gays. This is the Real Pineapple. This is your humble host, Hunter, here. Hope you're having a great night, day, weekend, whenever you're checking this out. I've got a review for this documentary called Love 2020, which is written and directed by Jacqueline Joseph. So, something that I've really enjoyed about doing the podcast is that I'll get things thrown on my radar that I just might have missed. You know, I try really hard to get y'all like a wider range of content. I don't want to just review all of the summer blockbusters. I want to review the indie stuff. I want to review musicals. I want to review documentaries. I want to review really anything and everything I can get my hands on in a timely fashion with hopefully still being a good partner and still a good cat dad. But one thing I really liked about this documentary, just from the trailer, is that it gave me a vibe of New York. It really felt like New York was almost its own character in this movie, very similar to something like The Taking of Pelham 1, 2, 3, where the city feels like its own character. Also, the fact that this takes place in 2020. This talks about how this is going to be Wimbledon. Wimbledon's going to go ahead and take place, and that it's the first Wimbledon that they have to go ahead and cancel since the Second World War, which is fucking insane when you think about how far back that was. And one of the things that the documentary does a really great job of is giving you a timeline. You always feel like you're caught up as far as the film is concerned. So, it talks about how March 1st, 2020, that's the first COVID case that's reported, and that's 6 months before the 2020 U.S. Open. And how the organization is going ahead and they're covering all of this and they're monitoring everything. And I think that it's crazy to think about that, 4 years of us living with COVID, how, as someone who's had it, not fun, by the way, it is crazy how much we've learned about it and how much we've been able to grow through it. But I remember, Leia was quarantining with me and my roommate at the time, and how just scary it was. How we were doing grocery pickups at 6 a.m. We had a routine down at Walmart to go ahead and hit certain aisles and all that, but we are always masked up. And myself, I still wear a mask if I'm out at like a big event. So I think it's crazy to think about how far we've come since then. Thank God we have vaccines now. But when you think about a city like New York and how many people are there and how much comes in and out of that city, especially artistically, let alone athletically, that's a ton of pressure for any city to go ahead and absorb. I still remember when Broadway was getting shut down and everything. It talks about the fact that the restaurant and the entertainment industry, in large part, shut down because of the lack of things that were coming out of New York, which is, crazy to think about. One thing that this documentary does go into, which I think that we really do forget about, is the anti-Asian bias that came out because of rhetoric that was pushed by certain presidents at the time. That's something that I think gets lost in the shuffle, and that we definitely want to kind of go like, haha, it wasn't that bad. No, it was fucking terrible. And I'm very happy that that Jacqueline was brave enough to go ahead and bring that back up, because that is something that people really do try to brush under the rug. I'm a casual tennis fan, I would say. I could definitely name you some players, but there were a lot of players that I just wasn't familiar with that this film goes ahead and talks about. People like Francis Francis TFO, people like Jamie Murray, people like Rohan Bopana. There were several athletes I just wasn't aware of, and while you don't get a ton of information on every single person, I think this documentary does a really good job as far as giving you like a very strong cliff notes on most of the athletes, and then giving you some more in-depth information with certain tennis players as we follow them on their journey. One thing that this documentary gets into that I really appreciate, because obviously tennis is the forefront of the documentary, but one of the things that I mentioned earlier is how New York feels like its own character in this film, and it gets into some of the stuff that New York does independent of tennis. It talks about how Isabel de Pietro went ahead and launched this program to help people who are working with the public, called Feed the Front Lines, how that's helping with people who are working in hospitals and teachers and things like that, which is a really cool thing. And they take 2 or 3 minutes to go ahead and kind of go ahead and talk about that. They talk about how the U.S. Open venue workers were preparing 25,000 meal packages per day for patients, healthcare workers, lower income school children. So they take these little pockets of the documentary, almost like a not quite like an intermission. It's because it's still obviously relevant to the documentary, but it just takes these different angles with it that I've personally found as engaging as the tennis stuff. One thing that I really like is that they talk to the U.S. Open tournament director named Stacey Allister, and she talks about the pressure of putting on the U.S. Open and dealing with climbing COVID cases. There's a point where they talk about how it gets up to 304,000 cases. I mentioned how the first COVID case was in March. By June, the New York City unemployment is 20%. That's the highest it had been since the Depression, and that's 3 months before the U.S. Open starts. And she talks about how devastating so many of these numbers are, but they'd having to have these debates essentially about if they're going to go ahead and pursue the tournament, if they're going to go ahead and push forward, and how much pushback and how much deliberation there was in that. And it gives you a nice behind the scenes peek as far as all these moving pieces that there were going on behind the scenes to go ahead and see if this was even feasible, let alone if they're going to go ahead and show this to the public. One thing that this documentary really gets across too is the severity of certain athletes having to drop out. They talk about this tournament that's put on in the UK called the Battle of the Brits, and how they were very cautious as far as COVID and spacing and social distancing, and yet people still got sick. They talked about how what's his name? I think it was Barty something. I think that's the name, but he went ahead and pulled out of U.S. Open, citing travel risks. Rafael Nadal, who won the U.S. Open the prior year, so that would have been 2019, he decides to not go ahead and chase a repeat due to COVID. Bianca Andreescu, I believe is how you say the name, the reigning champion, she goes ahead and withdraws. So I mean, there are all these dominoes and all these moving pieces, and because the documentary is throwing a lot at you, it still does a really good job of keeping you informed, which is actually quite impressive considering all the different athlete names and all the things that's thrown at you. There's a point where they talk about how when they start bringing players in, and this is something that I was actually curious about, because when they start talking about how there's 300 players being brought in from 55 countries to fly into the secure bubble to go ahead and play in the U.S. Open, I was like, logistically, that seems like that would A, be a nightmare, and B, how do you guarantee that these people are all being safe? And the short answer is you don't. They talk about that. They talk about the entitlement aspect of using these like quick COVID tests. I think rapid tests I think is what they were called, how using these rapid tests for these athletes and how there is a level of entitlement that these people are able to go ahead and, you know, move around and be flown in. And that's something that really wasn't a thing to the general public. It's really quite fascinating how they go ahead and break that down as well. That combined with the fact that they break down how social activism becomes a thing in the secure bubble with the Jacob Blake shooting, in particular, and with, you know, with Black Lives Matter rising to prominence. It's pretty crazy how much ground they do go ahead and cover in this. And also they do something that I know Fox News would be so happy about. They go ahead and they talk about the activism aspect and how it's always been prominent in sports, in tennis in particular. Billie Jean King being one example. I was really happy they brought up the Battle of the Sexes. I was really happy that they brought up Arthur Ashe. But I'm going to go ahead and wrap this up as far as getting to my final grade. I mentioned him earlier, but Rohan Bopana is probably the athlete I found myself the most invested in. I don't want to give away his journey, but something that you find out about him, especially him and his partner, and how he's able to go ahead and use his opportunity to go ahead and help others around him. I found that particularly inspiring and really quite beautiful. And they do, I wish more documentaries did this. They do kind of a Where Are They Now near the end of the documentary, which I really appreciate, and catches you up on most of the players that you're introduced to, goes ahead and gives their social media if you want to go ahead and, you know, stay in, follow up and everything. I really like that. I thought that was a very nice touch, and I wish more docs would do that. But at the end of the day, this is a solid B for me. I really enjoyed this. I thought this was informative. As I mentioned, it really does make New York feel like its own special place and like its own character. And it really does speak to the resilience of New York in general. It's very interesting because the fact they were able to pull this off, again, logistically, must have been a fucking nightmare. But they were able to pull this off, you know, for better or for worse. But, you know, the documentary does get into that. So it's quite interesting. So I was actually very, I felt informed by this. I found it very interesting. But yeah, y'all, you should definitely check this documentary out when you get a chance. Yeah, solid B from me. By the time you hear this review, I'm gonna have my review or my interview, pardon me, with the writer and the director of the documentary, Jacqueline Joseph. That will be live as well, so go ahead and check that out as well. But yeah, y'all, if you've seen this, let me know what you thought about it in the comments. You can go ahead and follow yours truly on YouTube at The Real Pineapple. That's REEL Pineapple. Make sure you hit the bell so you know when I'm going to be going live and when new reviews drop. You can go ahead and check me out on Blue Sky at realpineapple.bsky.social. That again is REEL Pineapple. You can follow me on TikTok, Instagram, and Twitter at JHunterRealPineapple. Again, JHunter, and then REEL, and then Pineapple. And you can follow me on Letterboxd at Black Shazam. Don't forget to go ahead and follow me on Twitch as well at twitch.tv/TheRealPineapple. And go ahead and like, share, subscribe, and rate the podcast. It definitely helps me out. You can find the podcast pretty much wherever you listen to podcasts. SoundCloud, Apple Podcasts, Podbean, Stitcher, iHeartRadio, Spotify, Amazon Music, TuneUp, and Samsung Podcast at The Real Pineapple. Thank you so much for listening, everyone. Stay safe out there. Take care of each other. I'll have more reviews coming up for y'all soon. But yeah, everyone, please stay safe out there. Give someone a compliment. Give someone a hug. We can always use more positivity. And never forget, as always, to keep it real.